Good morning from Washington to everyone. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and it is my genuine pleasure and honor today to host a book presentation and discussion with the Honorable Robert Zoellick. Bob Zoellick is a member of the executive committee of the board of the Peterson Institute and someone my colleagues and I have worked with for many years, but far more than that, he is someone of incredible stature and reach throughout the years of diplomacy, economic, and high politics for the last several decades. His resume is a record of accomplishment. He has served in the Treasury in the Department of State, in the White House, as the U.S. Trade Representative, as the President of the World Bank. He's been a lawyer. He's been a Kennedy School graduate, and he is with us today in his capacity as author and historian. His book, which I left in my reading chair, America in the World, and I think the "in" tells you what this is about, that diplomacy is a necessary piece of American policy, American self-interest. And Bob has pulled together an incredible array of interpretive stories and insights along 5 themes about how American diplomacy has been conducted for the last 250 years. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Adam, it's my pleasure. Thanks to Peterson Institute for having me.
Not at all. Let's start off with the obvious question. Why did you write the book? As you yourself acknowledge, this is a time when there's a lot of focus on other things than the conduct of diplomacy.
Well, perhaps like other people on this call, a number of years ago, I read Henry Kissinger's book, Diplomacy, and I enjoyed the way he used history to talk about foreign policy. But I had a sense it was written from a European perspective. So for a number of years, I've been thinking about how to do so, how to write something from the American experience and try to note a number of the ideas from the United States that have influenced its foreign policy. And so the approach I took, as you mentioned, was to focus on people, because I figure for a number of readers who enjoy biographies, that would be a good entry point. But also, I wrote about particular episodes because I wanted to emphasize the practical work of diplomacy. So while like others, I appreciated many of the intellectual frameworks that come from foreign policy or international relations courses, I wanted to try a different approach. I wanted to emphasize, from my experience, sort of the pragmatic work of diplomacy, whether economics, security, politics. I think there was another idea, which is I took courses in diplomatic history many decades ago, which I greatly enjoyed. As a field, that is somewhat faded, in part because, for good reasons, people have brought in unappreciated actors and perspectives. But I think the world of scholarship has lost something because there's been fewer efforts to try to draw the different aspects together. Fred Logoval, who's going to have a new book out on JFK, teaches at Harvard, and he wrote a piece for the New York Times saying, why have we stopped teaching political history? So I wanted to come back to that. And from my own discussions with some of my younger colleagues, insofar as the subject was taught, it tended to focus on events after World War II, Cold War, or years afterwards. And there's a very sort of rich series of accounts of people that for the first 150 years, including when the United States didn't have such dominant power, which is, I think, a good lesson to be learned. And as you know, I wanted to work in many of the roles of economic diplomacy as well as the traditional security topics.
Well, again, it's a tribute to how much of a broad focus you have, but also the key word in what you say, Bob, for me is the term pragmatic, and that's a theme you return to throughout the book. Let me ask you, because you have so many portraits of individuals that are fascinating, but let me ask you with the person who made economic policy and American history sexy, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. There is so much about him, his report on manufacturers, maybe he's an advocate for industrial policy, he's a nationalist, he's a federalist. what are the pragmatic and diplomatic lessons we should be taking, or what do you see as the key stories from the Hamilton period?
Well, as you say, Hamilton is truly the father of economic statecraft. And while, again, many with this forum know well his economic agenda in the United States, I wanted to show how it was connected to a foreign policy and diplomatic agenda. He was very much focused on systems of financial and economic power. So how the parts fit together. He has a keen insight in particularly in the role of financial credit and war fighting, which I return to at other chapters in the book. In 1781, he's on leave in his the study of his father-in-law, and he's trying to understand the nature of the conflict with Britain. And it's quite amazing the pieces he writes, because he basically recognizes this is a war of attrition, and he not only tries to appreciate America's posture, but also sort of Britain's posture in terms of its financial credit system, which he then brings to bear when he's Treasury Secretary. And one real interesting insight is he not only puts this system together, but he understands the role of confidence. So people here who know about markets, one of the reasons he pressed so much to deal with the debt issue promptly was he wanted from the start to communicate the United States' commitment to its credit. And there's a wonderful irony, because in the next chapter, when I talk about Thomas Jefferson, he really wouldn't have been able to buy Louisiana unless he had credit-worthy bonds. And by the way, he stumbles with the question of under the Constitution whether he can buy Louisiana, and Madison convinces him to basically take the Hamiltonian position. But also, Hamilton brings a strategic outlook. Remember, he was a soldier as well as a financial and economic person. He appreciates the role of the United States in the wider Atlantic world. This is not an isolationist. This is a man who's trying to understand how his country fits within it. He also has an appreciation of the Mississippi River Valley, so he has a sense of land and maritime power. And he has a recognition of balance of power. So Talleyrand, who actually is in the United States at this time, writes that Hamilton divined Europe, which he meant that he really understood sort of the power forces within the European context. And as part of this, Hamilton, amazingly, after just ending a war with Britain, starts what we would call today a strategic dialogue with Britain. And he actually postulates that the young United States could fit well within Britain's trading and international framework if Britain treats the United States with respect and removes its forces from various posts. And so in a way, he's 100 years ahead of his time. Lord Shelburne, who was the head of the British government that achieved the peace treaty, had a similar view, but the politics in both countries don't really accept it. So Hamilton becomes the author of the neutrality doctrine, which really drives much of US foreign policy for the next 100 or so years, although it has tilts in his policy, because again, when people understand the practical side, over 90% of the revenue of the United States came from those customs treatments. So if you cut off trade, you were going to cut off the financial lifeline. And by the way, that persists all the way up to the Civil War. In fact, the revenues remain about 50% all the way up till the creation of the income tax. So until you had an income tax, you really relied on these customs revenues. The farewell address, which many people know from foreign policy from George Washington, is really a statement about trying to preserve the Union. Remember, in that era, like this one, there's foreign intervention in elections, and there was a way of concern that it would divide the society. And I think the one other point about Hamilton worth noting is kind of his methods. And in the book throughout, I try to emphasize some of the ways in which people conduct diplomacy. Hamilton drew from Colbert in France the notion that officials should shape events, not just wait for them. Also, this point about perceiving how the whole system related to its parts. And like Ben Franklin, he has a sense that individuals matter and emotions matter. And that he makes the point about how minute circumstances can make a big difference when you're dealing with people. Franklin says small events can have big effects on important people and events, which may be a small point, but for people who would like to conduct diplomacy, it's probably a useful one to recall.
I will say that some of the Franklin stories you told in the book are also fascinating and about these small personal things, but I won't give away the story. Can we turn to another person who's obviously very well known, at least for people who read history, Cordell Hull, America's longest serving Secretary of State, I believe, and someone we in the economics profession think of as an advocate for trade as beneficial to foreign policy, beneficial to democracy. How should we look back at Cordell Hull's tenure?
Well, as you said, Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State under Franklin Roosevelt, was the longest serving, 11 years and 9 months. He had served many years in Congress before that, mainly in the House of Representatives, but some in the Senate. And he was a big believer that trade played a role in Americans' relations in the world beyond the economic efficiency that trade economists would focus on. So he's the prime figure for trade and foreign policy. And I use that chapter to try to offer a window on the combination of trade issues, constitution, domestic politics. Of course, the major event that he's dealing with is the Smoot-Hawley tariff of 1930, which moved the average American tariff up to about 59%. America's trade drops either by volume or dollar amount between 40 and 70%. Contributes to the depth of the Great Depression. As you know, the monetary factors were probably the most important ones, but the trade aspect certainly lengthened the Great Depression. And so in 1934, he convinces Roosevelt to try to pass something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934. And modern students of legislative politics would be shocked. It's 3 pages. That's all the act is. But it's very important for the history of American trade and policy in that it shifts the authority from Congress setting individual tariffs, as they did in Smoot-Hawley, to authorizing the executive to negotiate agreements to reduce tariffs. And at that time, the agreements did not have to come back to Congress, but they were limited in terms of the amount of tariff reduction. And that, of course, really is the foundation stone for what later becomes Fast Track or Trade Promotion Authority, sort of 80 years of American trade policy, based on the idea that if the executive who looks over the national agenda controls trade policy, that it will be more liberalizing and international than if it's left to individual members of Congress, which holds true until today, the Trump administration. Hull goes ahead and negotiates some 31 agreements with 28 countries. These are not free trade agreements, but they were efforts to lower tariffs. Doug Irwin at Dartmouth, who's got the best book on the history of trade policy in the U.S., notes that he brings tariff levels about down below the pre-Smoot-Hawley levels. But the most important thing that Hull does is these agreements establish the principles that are later in 1947 incorporated in the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, today the WTO, of most favored nation, non-discrimination, changing barriers into tariffs so you can reduce them. But I also emphasize, because sometimes people have a short-term historical view, that the battle over these trade policies was never easy. So I introduced a character lost to history named George Peake. And George Peake at the time in the 30s was an opponent of Hull's because he basically wanted to negotiate what today we call managed trade agreements. They were basically barter arrangements. He wanted to avoid having to deal with hard currencies. And so, for example, one of his major accords was with Germany, where we'd be exchanging cotton for wines, and you wouldn't, and the trade was basically within the two countries as opposed to buying goods and services that you could use currency in your global account. And this is the big showdown. And unfortunately for Peake, his prime country that he picks is Nazi Germany. And FDR actually approves the agreement. But Hull, to the surprise of everybody, is one of the few people that bests FDR on politics, because he points out dealing with Nazi Germany not only sort of is supporting a country that would use its hard currency for munitions, but it's not very popular with the American public. So he gets he gets FDR to sort of avoid it. I think the bigger points here is that, while trade cannot ensure peace, the whole view was it can build prosperity and friendships. It can lessen the risk of conflict with partners. Certainly, economic miseries can cause threaten political systems, and it can become the basis for other types of cooperation. So his trade partners are all basically, I think, other than Finland, all basically sort of allies during World War II. And this leads, as you know, the United States to support the post-World War II trade recovery system. And to bring this to at least a more current period, this background was in my mind in 2001 when I became trade representative. And many people will recall that the US trade agenda had sort of slowed down, lost its momentum. You had the Seattle sort of debacle trying to launch the global trade route. And I was reflecting how Hull had used his bilateral agreements to eventually push a multilateral agenda. And Fred Bergsten had the same idea around this time about competition and liberalization.
Yep.
So I was trying to push bilateral, regional, as well as global arrangements. And if one thinks about the evolution of that, I mean, the United States has free trade agreements now with 20 countries, really all but the North Americans and Israel sort of came out of that period. And they, while representing only about 10% of world GDP, they're about 40% of US exports, in part because of the geographic propinquity of Mexico and Canada. But that's also the logic that fed TPP, because with the 11 TPP economies, 6 of them we already had free trade agreements. So in the modern era, the idea is how could you use these agreements to develop cutting edge rules, which you could expand, just as Hull tried to use basic rules that were expanded. But so the environment is much more hostile today, but the world takes turns. Maybe some future political leaders will read the book and they'll come back.
Well, I mean, I appreciate your recognizing contribution of Fred Bergsten to open regionalism and competitive liberalization, and also our colleague Jeff Schott, who was very engaged with you at USTR.
Well,
but
the Peterson Institute is the prime player on trade policy these days, so keep it up.
Thanks. We will. But just to pick up on a very important thing, one of the structures of your book is America in the World. And I will hold up the cover again for those who missed me in the first minute or two, is that there are 5, you call them traditions or themes to American diplomatic history. And one of them is what you just talked about with Cordell Hull, the need to keep in account Congress and popular opinion as a very key part of the diplomatic arsenal. But not everybody's so public about it. Another person you profile in your book is someone who was unfamiliar to me, and I'm reasonably knowledgeable, someone named Will Clayton, who you make a case was incredibly influential.
So I wrote a chapter on the turn of 1947-49 to creating what we now know as the American alliance system, as you know, underpinned by economic networks. And this is a critical moment because for 150 years, America was avoiding alliances. Then we sort of create a new type of alliance system. Now, this ground has been written by a number of people. So I want to focus on some figures that were less known. And I focused on Will Clayton in part because, as you mentioned, his importance on economic. I also focus on Vandenberg because I want to emphasize the importance of the role of Congress in foreign policy making. So Will Clayton was a self-made man. He was an extremely successful cotton broker with a global business. And that gave him important insights on what he referred to as the division of labor, but we might refer kind of the value chain today, which in the aftermath of World War II helps him understand the breakdown in European economies because links throughout the chain no longer exist, whether it's credit or trade or other arrangements. He was an assistant secretary of state for economics, then advanced to undersecretary of state. He comes in right after Cordell Hull, but he's Cordell Hull's, in a sense, sort of prime disciple. And for those interested in the making of foreign policy, as Ben Steele's book on the Marshall Plan emphasized, it represents an interesting shift from the Treasury Department creating the Bretton Woods institutions to the State Department on these economic issues. And in a sense, the system that Harry Dexter White and Morgenthau created sort of assumed a world of US-Soviet Union cooperation, a pastoral Germany, a safe receding of the British Empire, trade relations resuming with sort of modest balance of payment support from the IMF. And by 1946 and 47, all these are incorrect. you need to have a system that, as opposed to maintains sort of economic stability, it's going to have to be created. And that's what where Clayton plays a sort of a key role. What I did some digging about his role with the Marshall Plan, which you often have associated with Kennan, and played an important role. But I found a dissertation and a report that if you actually match one of the memos that Clayton writes with the number of points he's recommending with the eventual Marshall Plan speed, there's a very good overlap. And not surprisingly, for people like Marshall, who are very practical people, or Truman, Clayton turns out to be a very effective advocate. His staff, including, by the way, a young Paul Nitze, become important in people trying to get a grasp on the balance of payments gap as a key issue for the Marshall Plan. But I also draw back in the gap negotiations, which you often don't see in this 47-49 period. And I share another story that I found revealing, which is the original negotiations were, if I recall, with 23 economies. The United States Congress has just passed a wool tariff of 50%, which leads Australia to say, well, we can't take part in a trade negotiation with that. If Australia pulls out, Britain, as the leader of the Commonwealth, feels it'll have to pull out. If Britain pulls out, there's not much for the other European economies. So Clayton comes all the way back to make a case to President Truman. And for those of us involved in policy, this is a familiar moment. That Truman gives Clayton 15 minutes, and he gives the Secretary of Agriculture 15 minutes. And the Secretary of Agriculture says, look, it doesn't matter about the international trading system. That's all theory. You could lose up to 7 states in the 1948 election if you don't sign this bill. And Clayton makes the case for supporting the creation of GATT, vetoing the tariff bill. That's what Truman does. And in fact, he permits a cut of the tariff about 25%. So we're able to launch the GATT system. And I love that story because I'm sure you've encountered this at various meetings where people say, well, after World War II, the United States had economic dominance. It could do all these things. It's harder now. Well, go back and look at the story of Clayton and Truman in 1920.
Amazing stuff. And I was totally unaware of that story. I had just 2 things before we continue. First, just to tell everyone who's registered as opposed to simply watching online, please do use the Q&A tool here on Zoom and post your questions, and we'll bring those up to Bob starting at 9 o'clock with attribution to those questions we use. No prizes though. You're going to have to buy your own copy of America in the World. The second thing, Bob, just going back to the book, getting away from some of the personal stories. So we talked about the 5 traditions, and I mentioned the concern for Congress and popular opinion as one of them. You sort of touched on another, talking about Hamilton, the emphasis on the North American continent, which then shows up in the trade. Could you talk a little bit more about the other 3 traditions and why you chose these as the themes?
Well, the first one is North America, which I wanted to stress because, again, if you look at most foreign policy papers these days, they'll talk about Europe, Asia, Middle East, maybe Latin America. North America rarely shows up. It was obviously very important in the 19th century. If you think about the 20th century, whether it was the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Zimmerman telegram, where the Imperial Germany offered Mexico to retake Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, they ignored California for some reason. It also was important for them. The NAFTA story was, of course, about much more than trade, but because it was an idea of a modernizing Mexico, reorienting toward the north. But I think if you think today about the issues the American public is interested in, they're questions of immigration, they're questions of economic integration, they're questions of narcotics and drugs, and they're questions of kind of the environmental topics. Those are all North American issues. And so in some ways, should be a natural for the focus of US foreign policy. But I also believe there's another step, which is that I believe a strong North America creates a better continental base for the United States in its global engagement. And again, I found this wonderful quote from Ronald Reagan launching his campaign in 1979, where he says, the United States would be better off if Mexico and Canada were stronger, not weaker. And it's time we stop thinking of our closest neighbors as foreigners. Now, this is launching his campaign, for goodness sakes. You know, imagine that in today's environment with either Biden or with Trump. It's inconceivable. The other, I talk about trade, transnationalism, and technology, the role of private actors, and throughout kind of from 1776, how trade was a important concept about America's relations with the world. The third is alliances, which he touched on, which is for the first 150 years, we try to avoid them. Then for the next 70 or 80 years, we create a new model system. And the question is, where will that go today? The fourth one you mentioned, Congress and public support, which a lot of foreign policy specialists often ignore. And then the fifth one is the idea of America's purpose in the world. And I didn't use exceptionalism because that term sort of aggravates some people abroad. What I was trying to cover was from the very start of the United States, when we were creating this new idea of a republic in a hostile world of empires, the United States has had a sense of purpose in the world. I talk about the Civil War and the notion of the Union and how that affects thinking. There's the open door policies. So it's a theme I try to draw out throughout the book about the ongoing role of if you think about your dollar bill on the back, you have the Great Seal of the United States. Many people haven't probably looked at it closely, but underneath that unfinished pyramid is Novus Ordo Seclorum, New Order of the Ages. So these people were thinking about bigger goals.
Well, Bob, thank you so much. Let me turn to the great list of questions we've accumulated from some very distinguished friends. And as you might expect from a Washington tuning in audience and a Peterson invited audience, a lot of them are about current policy and lessons, less about the history per se. So let me combine a couple questions first. So we have from Adeyinka Adeyemi, the senior advisor to the African Trade Policy Center for United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, talking about there's been a petulant, somewhat transactional approach to U.S. foreign policy manifested in lack of consideration for long-term interests, being sidelined as a leader. What things should be done to reclaim America's position and what is the cost? And similarly, Martin Wolf of the Financial Times asks, so where is the U.S. going to go in the world now? What difference will it make in this regard if either Trump or Biden wins? So picking up in some ways on your ideals point, Bob.
Yeah, well, I agree. If Trump's reelected, you're going to see a continuation of transactional, highly personalized politics. His style is also to be different from his predecessors. So if they didn't deal with North Korea, he would. If they had to deal with Iran, they wouldn't. And it's also an important recognition tied to his political base. So the wall with Mexico, for example, is a symbol as well as a policy. And I always believed he would keep trying to come back with that. He couldn't solve that problem, but he needed to sort of continue to stoke it. I think trade protection is part of that. The Biden administration, I think, is a little less clear. But let me offer a view that I think I'm writing something for Foreign Affairs online for September that's going to spell this out a little bit more, but it's a little different than people have heard so far. If you think about what a President Biden would face domestically, he's got a huge agenda. He's got pandemic recovery and the frayed healthcare system. He's got inclusive economic growth. He's got racial divisions and systemic problems. He's got environmental issues and climate change. He's got immigration. It's a staggering agenda. And for anyone that understands the American political system, there's only so much a president can get done, particularly through the congressional process. And if you look at the history of the Carter administration, the Clinton, the Obama administrations, they often struggle with the discipline of what they're going to accomplish in the first couple of years. And in fact, after 2 years, they run into trouble. I personally think if anyone has the skills to try to get things through Congress, Biden has accomplished a lot over 30 years. In some ways, he'll have more experience than anybody since LBJ. But that raises the question of what time will he have on the international agenda? And a lot of foreign policy people would like him to spend all this time on international topics, but I don't think that's practical. So my suggestion is that a new administration leverage what it does domestically on the international side. So for example, if we take action on immigration by executive order or dreamers, link it to the North American policy in rebuilding relations with Mexico and Canada. If he does something on climate change, don't just rejoin the Paris Accord, but figure out a way to sweep in the developing world. So for example, with Africa, a lot could be done with soil carbon that would help agriculture or avoided deforestation and forestation. On the pandemic issue, if we are fortunate enough to have vaccines and better treatments, go back and look at what Bush 43 did with the HIV/AIDS proposal for sub-Saharan Africa, which probably did more for U.S. relations with Africa than anything in history. And so as I go through each of these topics, and of course on the economic agenda, you can see a lot of win-win sort of possibilities of recovery as opposed to sort of build more barriers in the system. So and then frankly, that agenda would be a very good agenda with your prime allies. You can imagine those topics with Europe and Asia, and then you need to add to it the future of free societies and how you deal with China. And my view is it's best to do both those topics with your allies and partners. So what I notice in a lot of the foreign policy discussions today, it's a list of 20 items. And I'm just not sure that's a realistic way to approach this. How could a Biden administration leverage off its domestic progress internationally and reframe agenda with allies and partners?
That's a great summary, and we're looking forward to that article, Bob. And clearly, you're bringing the insights you have from White House Deputy Chief of Staff and Deputy Secretary of State very pragmatically again. You mentioned China, and we have a host of questions about China. Just let me read off a couple of the best phrased ones. Sharmeen Mosavar Rahmani says, given how China has behaved during the pandemic in terms of information and effective PPE and then IPR, how should the U.S. deal with China? And she says, given that past strategies have not been effective. We also have Gerardo Rodriguez saying, how do you think that China will adjust and adapt their strategy to engage with the rest of the world now that they're getting considerable pushback, not only from the U.S., but Europe, India, and some Belt and Road countries? I mean, many questions. You've been writing a lot and speaking a lot on the China. You had the concept of responsible stakeholder you put forward some years ago. Sorry to give you so much buildup, but I know you have so much to say. So figuring out what you want to say about China in this context.
Well, maybe we should schedule another session on China because I can't address all those. But I guess let me start since my book is a historical one about sort of three themes that I would draw from the American experience with China that I think are applicable today. So one, you see this belief of China as the great commercial dream, the great commercial market, which is always just hovering over the horizon, not quite reached. Although to be fair, China was our fastest growing export market for 15 years prior to the Trump administration. So there's a lot of US companies, a lot of US workers that have benefited from that relationship. Second, there's the notion of how does China fit in the world as a regional or global power? So in the early period, such as John Hay at the time of 1900, the open door, it's stopping the breakup of China. People forget Europe divided sub-Saharan Africa. It could have happened to China. In the 20s, it was an effort to how do you build the Republic of China to play a sort of larger role. FDR has the idea that China will be one of the four horsemen in stabilizing regional power. Nixon and Kissinger have the notion of China with triangular diplomacy. My responsible stakeholder was the idea of moving from beyond integration to having China assume sort of responsible roles in the international system. So that's another very important theme about this power, whether weak or strong. But there's a third tradition that a lot of Americans don't, I think, recall, and that's the missionary tradition. So a lot of our ties with China from the start are missionaries and their children who become the authors, the foreign service officers, Pearl Buck. And that tradition is to try to convert China, whether it be to Christianity, small r republicanism, capitalism. And you can see when China decides not to become a junior America, but instead to become China, there's very harsh reaction. You saw this in the Boxer Rebellion. You saw it in 1949, the Communist Revolution. You saw it in 1989. We're seeing it today. So you see this pendulism. And in some ways, the US hostility almost seems sharper because there's a sense of rejection. So I guess my starting point is it's always useful to recognize China as it is, as opposed to how we might want it to be. That doesn't mean that you don't have a policy in some cases to deter China or influence China. But coming back to one of the comments, there's a new conventional wisdom that has crept in, that cooperation with China failed. And that infuses a lot of the thinking. I wrote an article in the National Interest in March and April for people interested in this, where I give a long litany of things on the economic, security, environmental side, UN relations, that is just totally false. I mean, so to take the economic topics, as you know, China had a global current account surplus of 10%. That's about down to zero. It stopped manipulating its exchange rate. It had the greatest stimulus program in the global financial crisis. Even in the WTO, where you look at the quantitative commitments, they were much deeper than other developing countries, and they basically met them. The problem was in some of the sort of less specific intellectual property or forced technology transfer. And my point on this is, if you're going to deal with a world of climate change or pandemics and biological security or economic growth or proliferation, you're going to need to figure out a way to work with China. And my approach would be work with allies and partners. There are also forces within China. I recognize that Xi's regime has changed and tried to strengthen the role of the Communist Party. So that's part of recognizing the sort of reality. But if we approach this with the idea that cooperation produced nothing, you're misleading yourself about what can be accomplished here. And take intellectual property rights. I mean, a lot of this is granular. So intellectual property rights, many people may know China's actually created these courts. They're finding for foreigners about 90% of the time, but the penalties aren't high enough. So focus on that issue. With the forced technology transfer, I think some of this is endemic as long as you have joint ventures. So as opposed to doing a purchase agreement, which the Peterson Institute has rightly sort of observed is only about sort of halfway being met, well, I'd be focusing on issues like stopping the requirement for joint ventures in these areas. So there can be common ground. And for those that don't believe so, I guess I ask themselves in a very pragmatic way, what do you think confrontation will produce? Right. You know, what have we gotten done here in our relationship with China? And the last point is, I do believe there's always a role for America's stand for its aspirations and its beliefs. Ronald Reagan, I have a chapter on Reagan here, had the ability with the Soviet Union to talk about freedom as an aspiration, not as a way of insulting or clobbering their counterpart as you have in the current administration. And today, what that would mean to me is, as opposed to sanctioning leaders in Hong Kong, I would do what the British are doing and say, if people from Hong Kong want to come to the United States, fine, let's let some of those people come to America. That's the way to show the difference between a free society and an authoritarian system. So the problem with China policy is people want to have, you know, sort of a simplistic solution. That's not going to work. And I guess what I would counsel people is, whatever your view is of Chinese performance and behavior, ask yourself what you want to get done and how you're going to try to achieve it with others, as opposed to just throwing verbal bombs. The relationship right now, I'll close with this, is in free fall. It's quite dangerous. And people need to be aware that miscalculations can happen, and issues with Taiwan and others can sort of move to a danger zone. And I hope people don't take for granted some of the things that have been accomplished with China.
It's great to hear you say all that, Bob. And if you'll allow me, this is one common thread of you with Kennan and Kissinger and other classics of American diplomatic history, is that the idea that countries don't just go away. There isn't a resolution, there isn't a solution, there isn't a conversion, that you have to just keep managing, keep moving the ball forward. And I take, obviously you say a lot more than that, but I take that as part of the spirit of why you focus on diplomatic history. Let me take you back a little bit more into the economics. We have a number of people who've asked about balance of payments, and you made mention when talking about Will Clayton and Cordell Hull that that was already a concern, and obviously for Hamilton that was a concern. When you were working for Jim Baker and there was the Plaza Accord, the U.S. trade balance and balance of payments were a concern. How do you see that as an issue in U.S. foreign policy now? Should we be concerned about the U.S. trade deficits in the current context? Should we be concerned about them in the way the Trump administration and Ambassador Lighthizer are? I'm concatenating a bunch of people's questions. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I think probably one of the messages, if one takes a historical look at this, is trying to see the interconnections of items. So if we go back to the period with Baker and the Plaza Accord, where again, Fred Bergston and the Peterson Institute made some very important contributions through the late Dick Darman in terms of the thinking of this. This was an era of rising protectionism in the United States because the dollar had risen so much in the course of the early 80s. The Reagan administration wanted to promote a trade agenda. So you had the launch of the Eurobay round in 1986, but it needed at that time a fast track. And so it was going to have legislation go through. So the G7 economic coordination of that era needs to be seen as a way of partly trying to deal with misaligned exchange rates. But also the original strategy was to connect this to at least some discussion with key economies about the nature of economic fundamentals. So people may recall the finance ministers originally were a 5, the 7 were the economic summit. Baker and Darman had this idea of connecting those two so that the finance ministers would meet regularly. They would put their forecasts forward, and then the IMF was asked simply to say, okay, if this is what their countries say they want to do, what will happen in the international system? And then it was trying to bring the IMF as an institution in more as sort of a monitor and prodder. And then the connection to the summit level was if there are going to be issues to try to deal with of a national economic nature, it's going to have to be done at the heads of government level. And again, I think Fred had this experience in the Carter administration with the Bonn Summit was part of an effort. Now that effort faded and it fell away during the course of much of the 90s. Although I think the Clinton administration tried to use some of that system in dealing with the debt crisis of the period. But notice how it reemerges with the G20. So now I'm at the World Bank, and Gordon Brown, I think to his credit, used the G20 mechanism in 2009 to create a global response that had its weaknesses. But if you ask yourself today about the world economy and ask yourself what could be done through a G20, I'm afraid we'd be in a much weaker position. And to give people a sense of some of the specifics on this, this is where the international institutions like the WTO and the World Bank can plug into the system and be more effective. In the global financial crisis, Pascal Lamy at the WTO and I at the World Bank sort of recognized that the new bank requirements for capital, sort of closing the door after the barn had left the horse, the horse had left the barn, were killing trade finance. And particularly a number of developing countries, including sub-Saharan Africa, who hadn't caused the crisis and frankly could be one of the ways to get out of the crisis, were getting squeezed very badly. We used kind of our institutions and our experience to go back to the banking authorities and say, look, please recognize the problem that you're causing. Can we alleviate this in some way so as not to choke off trade finance? I launched something quite similar called the Vienna Initiative with the EBRD, where with the Eastern European banks, I was concerned that Western European banks would pull out all their capital. So, and today, as you know, and the Peterson Institute is a good scholarship on this, is that, people have underappreciated the role of the Federal Reserve swaps in the global financial crisis and in this crisis. So you have these networks of experienced institutions that can at least help alleviate some of the challenges, help anticipate them along the way. So if you ask about sort of current account, obviously, I don't think that bilateral accounts matter. I think the Trump approach, is sort of misappreciated the role of those in economics, and it's distorted the overall trade policy. I think the bigger issue for me than sort of global current accounts is the question of the understandable policies that monetary authorities are having to take in the current situation. So what will be the aftershocks of those? What will be the distorting effects on those? And those are the types of issues that, frankly, the leading world economies need to try to at least anticipate and try to develop some precautionary measures for.
Well, this is a fabulous example, Bob, of how you see the whole board, as the fictional president Jed Bartlett said was key on the West Wing. And you've shown how others have seen it in American diplomatic history. The new book is America in the World, A History of U.S. Diplomacy and Foreign Policy by the Honorable Robert B. Zoellick. Thank you all for joining us today. This video will be out and posted, and I hope you'll share Bob's wisdom and stories widely. Thank you so much, Bob, for your time.
Thanks for having me, Adam. Thanks for people attending.